For 40 years, Richie Sambora and Bon Jovi sold the world a simple myth. Two Jersey brothers who found lightning in a guitar riff and never let go. The posters said unity. The choruses promised forever. But the truth of long partnerships is rarely loud. It is usually quiet, slow, and privately humiliating. And now, at 65, Richie Sambora is finally speaking in a way that changes how the story sounds. Not as a bitter ex-bandmate chasing headlines, but as a man describing what it feels like to be essential to a legacy and still feel replaceable. The public remembers the talk box and Livin' on a Prayer, the steel and dust swagger of Wanted Dead or Alive, and the aching lift of I'll Be There For You. The industry remembers stadium numbers, platinum plaques, and a brand that became bigger than any one person. Richie remembers something else. The moment brotherhood started turning into a corporate hierarchy, and the moment his own voice inside the machine became smaller than the cheering outside it. In 2013, he vanished from a tour with almost no warning. The statement said, "Personal reasons," the polite phrase that hides every ugly truth. Fans argued for years about what really happened. Burnout, addiction, family, ego, money, power. Richie let the noise happen without correcting it, because sometimes silence is the only way to survive a room where your words no longer matter. But that silence has a cost. A decade later, in a wave of renewed attention around the band's modern era and its retrospective narratives, Richie has framed his exit with one phrase that lands like a confession. He ghosted. He regrets not the decision to leave, but the way he left, and he has apologized publicly to the fans and to the band, acknowledging how abrupt it was and how much confusion it created. Yet an apology is not the same thing as surrender. It can also be a key that unlocks the door to the real argument. What happens when the face of the band becomes the whole band? Richie's side of the story is not that John stole the spotlight in a single dramatic betrayal. It is that the spotlight slowly became a structure. Decisions moved upward. Input turned optional. Presence stopped meaning influence. And by the end, Richie says it felt less like a brotherhood and more like a business, a climate he has described as toxic after years of erosion and exhaustion. The most painful part is not even the leaving. It is the way leaving happened. Richie says he learned major steps, including how quickly the machine kept rolling in the same modern way fans did, through the internet. The man who helped build the sound woke up to realize the brand had learned how to function without him. And once you truly understand that feeling, those classic hits stop sounding like nostalgia. They start sounding like a contract between two men that expired quietly, without a final handshake. Long before stadium lights and platinum plaques, Richie Sambora and Bon Jovi were simply two ambitious musicians shaped by the same blue-collar gravity of New Jersey. They came from towns where aspiration was not romanticized but earned the hard way, through repetition, rejection, and relentless persistence. In Woodbridge and Sayreville, dreams were not encouraged. They were tolerated only if you proved you could survive chasing them. That pressure forged both men early. It also explains why their bond, once formed, ran deeper than contracts or credits. Their early paths were parallel rather than intersecting. John fronted small projects like the Wild Ones, cultivating the instincts of a natural leader and storyteller, while Richie sharpened his craft in bands such as Message, absorbing blues, phrasing, and melodic discipline from long nights in modest clubs. They played VFW halls, backyard parties, and half-empty rooms where the sound system was unreliable and the crowd indifferent. What unified them was not just hunger, but a shared reverence for musicians who understood narrative weight. Springsteen's working-class poetry, Zeppelin's muscular drama, the idea that rock could feel both massive and intimate at the same time. When Richie officially joined Bon Jovi in 1983, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. He did not arrive as a hired technician. He arrived as a co-author of the band's emotional language. His guitar tone brought warmth and grit that grounded John's anthemic instincts. His harmony sense lifted choruses into something communal rather than performative. On stage, their chemistry was obvious even in small rooms like the Fast Lane in Asbury Park, where proximity amplified connection. John commanded the room with charisma. Richie filled the air with texture and restraint. Together, they created a sound that felt larger than its parts. As the band's ascent accelerated, that partnership began to define an era. Songs that would later be etched into cultural memory were born from this dual engine. The talk box line in Livin' on a Prayer was not a flourish. It was a signature that fused vulnerability with spectacle. The stark, cinematic tension of Wanted Dead or Alive carried as much emotional weight from Richie's phrasing as from John's vocal delivery. Even most sentimental ballads leaned on Richie's instinct for when to speak and when to stay silent. His guitar did not compete with the lyric, it completed it. Offstage, the image mirrored the music. Backstage laughter, shared interviews, and tour camaraderie reinforced the idea of brotherhood. To fans, the band looked unified, almost inseparable. Inside that unity, however, a quiet structure was forming. As the band grew, so did the necessity of a single public face. Marketing, media, and industry mechanics gradually centered on John as the embodiment of the brand. It was not a hostile move, and it was not announced. It was simply how the system worked. Someone had to stand at the center, and John fit that role naturally. For Richie, this shift was subtle but consequential. He remained deeply committed to the vision they built together, continuing to co-write, tour, and deliver performances that anchored the band's sound. Yet the balance of recognition began to tilt. His contributions were everywhere in the music, but less visible in the narrative. He stood just outside the spotlight center, even as his work shaped the very songs that kept the spotlight burning. In the early years, that imbalance was easy to ignore. Success was loud, and the mission felt shared. What made this period so powerful, and later so painful, was the sincerity of their early bond. This was not a manufactured partnership assembled by executives. It was two Jersey musicians discovering a rhythm that felt once in a lifetime. They trusted each other. They relied on each other. And they believed that the music would always be enough to hold everything together. But success has a way of rearranging relationships without asking permission. While the world saw a perfect machine roaring forward, something quieter was taking shape behind the music, a hierarchy born not of malice, but of momentum. And once that structure settles in, even brothers can find themselves standing on different ground without realizing how far apart they have drifted. If John Bon Jovi was the voice that carried the band into living rooms and arenas, Richie Sambora was the pulse that made those songs feel human. In the mid-1980s, as Bon Jovi's sound crystallized into something unmistakable, Sambora's guitar stopped being an accessory and became a narrative instrument. His playing did not shout for attention. It listened first, then answered. That instinct separated him from a generation of guitarists chasing speed and spectacle. Where others stacked notes, Sambora carved space. Where glam metal leaned toward gloss, he leaned toward grit. The result was a band that could sell millions without losing emotional credibility. Sambora's approach was rooted in blues logic rather than technical bravado. Each solo functioned like a paragraph inside the song's story, rising when the lyric needed release and retreating when silence said more. On tracks like I'll Be There For You, his restraint carried the ache that the words alone could not fully express. On arena anthems, his phrasing anchored the bombast, giving the choruses a sense of earned triumph rather than empty noise. This was not accidental. It was the product of a musician who understood that feel, timing, and tone mattered more than dominance. He played for the song, not for the scoreboard. The studio became the clearest evidence of his role. Sambora's fingerprints were everywhere. Arrangement decisions, harmony layers, and the subtle choices that transformed demos into classics. While John Bon Jovi delivered vocal clarity and mass appeal, Sambora built the emotional scaffolding beneath it. He knew when a chorus needed to soar and when it needed to ache. He knew how to use texture to suggest vulnerability inside songs that otherwise projected confidence. That balance gave Bon Jovi its defining duality: toughness with tenderness, swagger with sincerity. Albums like Slippery, When Wet, and New Jersey were not just commercial victories. They were blueprints for how arena rock could feel personal without losing scale. On stage, this dynamic became almost theatrical. John stood at the front, commanding attention with posture, movement, and vocal power. Sambora stood slightly to the side, often half-turned toward the band, listening as much as playing. To the casual eye, it looked like hierarchy. To musicians, it looked like trust. Sambora's job was not to lead the gaze, but to hold the center steady. His talk box on Livin' on a Prayer became iconic precisely because it was unexpected, a mechanical voice expressing something raw, almost pleading. It symbolized the band's ability to merge spectacle with soul, and it worked because Sambora treated even the flashiest moment as part of the story, not a trick. Critics and peers recognized this quietly. Within musician circles, Sambora was often described as the emotional architect of Bon Jovi's sound, the element that kept the music from tipping into caricature. His harmonies thickened choruses without crowding them. His rhythm work added tension that made releases feel earned. Even his silence mattered. He understood that not playing could be as powerful as playing, a discipline that separated seasoned storytellers from showmen chasing applause. Yet history has a way of simplifying narratives. As Bon Jovi's global profile grew, the public story narrowed. The band became synonymous with its frontman. Media coverage, branding, and legacy framing elevated John as the singular figurehead, a role he inhabited convincingly and effectively. Sambora's contributions remained audible, but increasingly invisible. The irony was cruel. The more essential his feel became to the band's identity, the less visible his authorship appeared in the mainstream telling. Fans sang along to melodies shaped by his instincts without knowing where that emotional pull came from. This imbalance did not erupt overnight. It accumulated quietly. As tours intensified and schedules tightened, decisions became streamlined. Creative discussions shortened. Authority centralized. For a musician whose value lay in nuance and collaboration, this shift felt like erosion. Sambora has described moments where being present in rehearsals or sessions did not guarantee being heard. The machine was moving too fast, and it had learned how to move without asking every voice for permission. From the outside, the band looked stronger than ever. Inside, the emotional economy was changing. Personal strain compounded the problem. The pressure of constant touring collided with Sambora's private battles, including addiction struggles and the emotional fallout of his divorce. These vulnerabilities did not exist in isolation. They interacted with a work environment that no longer felt safe or supportive. The music industry is rarely gentle with weakness, and success often leaves little room for recalibration. Sambora found himself searching for stability at the exact moment the band demanded maximum output. The disconnect between the smiling images on stage and the silence backstage grew wider. What hurt most, by his later account, was not criticism or conflict but indifference. Feeling replaceable in a project you helped build from nothing cuts deeper than public argument. Sambora continued to show up, continued to play, continued to deliver the sound fans expected. But emotionally, he was already stepping back. The guitar that once felt like a voice began to feel like a shield. He played his role while slowly withdrawing from a structure that no longer recognized his internal cost. By the early 2000s, the partnership that once thrived on mutual reliance had shifted into something colder. It was not a dramatic implosion, but a corrosion. Trust thinned, warmth faded, communication narrowed to logistics. Sambora has since described the environment as becoming more corporate than communal, a place where efficiency mattered more than empathy. That realization reframed his understanding of the band's success. What once felt like shared destiny now felt like a system with momentum of its own. In hindsight, this period explains why his eventual departure would feel less like a single decision and more like an inevitable outcome. The soul behind the strings had been carrying weight that never made it into the official narrative. And when that weight became too heavy to carry quietly, stepping away was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of preservation. Before the silence of 2013, before the headlines and speculation, the real break had already happened years earlier, in rehearsal rooms where the music still sounded unified, but the bond beneath it had begun to thin. By the time Bon Jovi entered the new millennium as a fully established global institution, the band no longer functioned like the hungry unit that once squeezed magic out of small rooms and shared uncertainty. It functioned like an enterprise. Schedules were optimized. Decisions were streamlined. The margin for emotional negotiation shrank. On the surface, everything looked intact. Sold-out tours, recognizable hits, a catalog that continued to perform across generations. But beneath that polish, the internal chemistry that once made the machine feel alive had shifted in a way that was difficult to reverse. For Richie Sambora, this era marked the slow realization that contribution and control were no longer linked. He was still essential to the sound fans loved, still a co-author of the band's most enduring music, yet his influence over the direction, pace, and priorities of the group was diminishing. Decisions increasingly arrived fully formed rather than debated. The collaborative friction that once sharpened ideas was replaced by efficiency. What had once been a conversation between equals began to feel like instructions flowing one way. This was not framed as conflict. There were no shouting matches, no public ultimatums, no dramatic walkouts. That absence made it harder to name the problem, and therefore harder to solve. When tension does not explode, it corrodes. Sambora has later described the feeling as being present but unheard, physically in the room but emotionally sidelined. Rehearsals continued. Recording sessions happened. Tours rolled on. Yet the space to shape the future of the band grew narrower with each cycle. At the same time, Jon Bon Jovi was navigating his own transformation. As the public face of the band, he carried responsibilities that extended far beyond music. Media obligations, brand stewardship, and the pressure to sustain relevance in a changing industry demanded decisiveness. From his perspective, clarity and control were not power plays. They were survival mechanisms. Bon Jovi was no longer just a band. It was a legacy operation that employed crews, fed families, and answered to expectations far larger than artistic impulse. Leadership hardened as the stakes rose. The problem was not that one man was wrong and the other was right. The problem was that their needs diverged. Sambora needed space, acknowledgement, and emotional safety. Jon needed momentum, coherence, and certainty. Those needs are not inherently incompatible, but they require constant negotiation. Over time, that negotiation faded. What replaced it was silence, a quiet agreement to keep moving forward rather than reopen unresolved fractures. Personal struggles magnified the strain. Sambora's battles with addiction and the emotional toll of his divorce did not occur on the margins of his career. They collided directly with the band's relentless pace. Touring schedules left little room for recovery or reflection. Vulnerability, in an environment built for endurance, often reads as liability. Sambora has said that during this period he felt increasingly isolated, not because no one knew he was struggling, but because the system had no capacity to slow down for him. Inside the band, perception began to shift. Where Sambora once felt like a co-owner of the vision, he now felt like a component. A vital one, but replaceable. That realization carries a specific kind of sting. It is not the pain of being fired. It is the pain of discovering that the thing you helped build has learned how to imagine itself without you. That knowledge settles quietly, reshaping how every rehearsal feels, how every flight to the next city feels, how every encore sounds. By the late 2000s, the emotional distance was unmistakable to those closest to the situation. Sambora continued to perform, continued to deliver the guitar work fans expected, but his internal connection to the project was thinning. He has described a sense of drifting, of playing a role rather than living inside it. The band, meanwhile, maintained its public image of unity. From the outside, there was no reason to suspect anything was wrong. That contrast between appearance and reality only deepened the exhaustion. What makes this phase so critical is that it reframes the narrative of Sambora's eventual exit. It was not a spontaneous decision triggered by a single argument or crisis. It was the endpoint of a long internal negotiation that had already failed. Each tour, each album cycle, each compromise pushed him closer to the edge of what he could sustain. By the time the world noticed his absence, he had already been gone emotionally for years. There's a temptation, in stories like this, to assign blame, to reduce the collapse of a partnership to ego, ambition, or betrayal. But the truth is more mundane and more tragic. Long-term success often rewards structures that are efficient rather than humane. It privileges continuity over care. In such systems, relationships do not end because people stop caring. They end because caring becomes impractical. Sambora's experience reflects that reality. The band did not turn hostile. It simply became inhospitable to the version of him that needed room to heal. As the pressure accumulated, one question began to outweigh all others. What was the cost of staying? For years, Sambora had measured his worth through endurance. He showed up, delivered, and absorbed the strain. But endurance has limits. When the music no longer felt like refuge, when the partnership no longer felt reciprocal, staying became an act of self-erasure. Leaving, then, was not about abandoning the band. It was about reclaiming agency in a life that had been subsumed by a machine too large to bend. This is why the eventual rupture, when it came, felt both shocking and inevitable. To fans, it appeared sudden. To Sambora, it was the final step in a process that had been unfolding quietly, methodically, and painfully. The cracks behind the anthem had been there all along. They were simply hidden by the volume of the music and the power of the brand. In April 2013, the illusion finally cracked. Just hours before a Bon Jovi show in Calgary, a brief announcement rippled through fans and media alike. Richie Sambora would not be performing. The explanation was a familiar, carefully neutral phrase, personal reasons, offered without detail, timeline, or reassurance. For a band built on consistency and ritual, the absence felt seismic. Sambora was not a peripheral member who could quietly rotate out. He was a pillar of the sound, a face audiences had grown up with, a presence woven into the band's identity. His sudden disappearance created a vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. At first, many assumed it was temporary. Fans had seen breaks before. Health issues, family emergencies, short pauses followed by returns. But days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Sambora did not reappear. The band continued touring, and eventually it became clear that something fundamental had shifted. Privately, Sambora was unraveling under the accumulated weight of years spent negotiating a place for himself inside a structure that no longer felt collaborative or safe. What looked abrupt from the outside was, for him, the final moment of a long internal collapse. The most painful detail, revealed later, was not that the band moved on, but how. Sambora has said that he learned the group had hired a replacement guitarist not through a conversation, but through the internet. For someone who had given decades of loyalty and creative labor, that realization landed like a physical blow. It confirmed the fear he had been quietly carrying. The machine no longer required his consent. The project he helped build could now erase him without ceremony. That is a particular kind of heartbreak, one that does not come from conflict, but from absence. In interviews years later, Sambora described the environment he left as toxic, not in the sense of open hostility, but in its emotional climate. The band, in his telling, had become more corporation than brotherhood. Decisions were transactional. Relationships were managed rather than nurtured. Creativity was filtered through efficiency. He felt unheard, creatively restricted, and spiritually exhausted. The irony was sharp. The same discipline and drive that had fueled the band's ascent now made it impossible for him to breathe inside it. Family became the decisive factor. Sambora has repeatedly pointed to his daughter, Ava, as the anchor that pulled him away from the stage. She was entering her teenage years, a period he recognized as fleeting and formative. Years of constant touring had already created distance he could not undo. The choice in front of him was stark: continue honoring a schedule that demanded everything, or step back to be present for the one relationship he could not afford to lose. In his words, "You only get one chance to be a parent." The applause would always be there. Childhood would not. That decision did not come without backlash. Some fans accused him of abandonment, of unprofessionalism, of betraying the audience that had supported him for decades. Others defended him, seeing his exit as an act of courage rather than desertion. Sambora absorbed both reactions, largely in silence. He did not mount a media tour to explain himself. He did not counter rumors in real time. He disappeared, not just from the stage, but from the conversation. That silence allowed the narrative to harden without his input. It also protected him while he rebuilt his life away from the glare. For the band, the transition was swift. Shows went on. A new guitarist filled the slot. From a business perspective, the continuity was impressive. From a human perspective, it was devastating. The speed with which the operation adapted reinforced Sambora's sense of erasure. He was not gradually phased out. He was replaced. The song sounded familiar enough. The brand remained intact. But for those who listened closely, something ineffable was gone. The soul behind the strings had vanished, leaving behind a technically complete but emotionally altered soundscape. The years that followed were marked by distance rather than drama. Sambora did not publicly attack Bon Jovi or the band. John, for his part, offered only restrained comments, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation while focusing on moving forward. There are no explosive interviews, no tabloid wars, no theatrical feuds. The absence of spectacle made the rift harder to process. Fans were left with unanswered questions and the uneasy feeling that something deeply personal had ended without closure. In retrospect, the disappearance was not an impulsive act. It was an act of preservation. Sambora did not leave because he no longer loved music. He left because the version of music he was living no longer allowed him to survive intact. The exit was not about ego or money. It was about agency, about choosing a life that did not require constant self-negation, about stepping away from a machine that had outgrown the people who once fed it. This reframing matters because it challenges the simplistic narratives often attached to high-profile departures. Artists are rarely granted the complexity afforded to ordinary people. Their decisions are reduced to headlines, their motives flattened into cliches. Sambora's disappearance resists that reduction. It was not a tantrum. It was not a scandal. It was the quiet conclusion of a long internal argument about worth, belonging, and the price of endurance. When he finally began to speak years later, the tone was not accusatory. It was reflective, even remorseful. He acknowledged that the way he left caused confusion and pain. He admitted he should have communicated better, but he did not retract the choice itself. Leaving saved him. It allowed him to rebuild his relationship with his daughter, to confront his own struggles, and to redefine success on terms that did not involve selling out arenas at the cost of his inner life. The disappearance of 2013 closed one chapter of rock history, but it opened another, quieter story about what happens after the lights go out. It revealed that the most consequential exits are not always loud. Sometimes they happen in silence, when a man finally decides that staying would mean disappearing even more completely than leaving ever could. For more than 10 years after his disappearance, Richie Sambora lived in a strange limbo. He was neither fully gone from public memory nor present enough to shape the narrative of his exit. Fans debated his motives. Commentators recycled old rumors. The band's history continued to be told largely without his voice. Sambora chose not to interrupt that process. Silence, once again, became his shield. But silence also has a way of hardening into regret when left unattended. In 2024, that silence finally broke. In a series of rare, emotionally candid interviews, Sambora spoke publicly about his departure in a way he never had before. The most striking moment was not an accusation or a revelation about power dynamics. It was an apology. "I just disappeared," he admitted. "I ghosted." The word carried weight because it acknowledged not only what he did, but what he failed to do. He did not frame himself as a victim of circumstance alone. He took responsibility for the confusion and hurt his sudden absence caused, especially to the fans who had invested decades of loyalty. The apology mattered because it reframed the story. For years, the public conversation had focused on why he left. Sambora shifted the focus to how he left. He acknowledged that regardless of the internal pressures and emotional exhaustion he was carrying, the lack of communication created unnecessary pain. He said plainly that he should have spoken directly to Bon Jovi, should have explained himself, should have closed the door with words instead of silence. That admission did not erase the reasons behind his decision, but it humanized them. At the same time, Sambora made it clear that the apology was not a reversal. He stood by the choice to leave. The regret was procedural, not existential. He did not apologize for prioritizing his mental health or his daughter. He apologized for the absence of clarity. This distinction is crucial. It reveals a man who has spent years reflecting on the difference between necessity and execution. Leaving saved him. How he left haunted him. In these interviews, Sambora described the cumulative emotional toll that led to his breaking point. He spoke about feeling creatively stifled, increasingly sidelined, and reduced to a functional role in a project he once helped shape. He emphasized that there was no single argument or dramatic rupture that pushed him out. It was a slow buildup of unresolved frustration. By the time he stepped away, he said he was operating in survival mode. Communication felt impossible not because he did not care, but because he was depleted. The response to his apology was immediate and complex. Many fans expressed relief. For the first time, they felt they had been acknowledged rather than abandoned. Others questioned why it took so long. Why now? Why not then? Sambora did not offer a strategic explanation. He spoke instead about timing and readiness. Healing, he suggested, does not follow public schedules. It happens when a person is finally strong enough to face the damage they left behind. Notably, the apology did not trigger a public reconciliation. Bon Jovi responded with restraint and professionalism, acknowledging their shared history without opening the door to reunion. There was no public back and forth, no dramatic embrace, no promise of future collaboration. That absence disappointed some fans, but it underscored a deeper truth. Closure does not always look like reunion. Sometimes it looks like mutual recognition of where the story ends. Sambora's reflections also revealed how much his understanding of success had changed. In his earlier career, success was measured in scale: ticket sales, chart positions, cultural saturation. In his post-Bon Jovi life, the metrics were quieter: presence, stability, the ability to wake up without dread. He spoke openly about therapy, about confronting patterns he once avoided, about learning to separate identity from output. These were not the confessions of a man angling for redemption through nostalgia. They were the reflections of someone who had stepped outside the machine and finally had room to think. The apology also served another purpose. It returned agency to Sambora's story. For years, his exit had been interpreted for him. By speaking on his own terms, he reclaimed authorship. He did not rewrite history, but he added depth to it. He acknowledged fault without self-flagellation. He honored the music without romanticizing the environment that produced it. He allowed both pride and regret to coexist. Perhaps the most telling aspect of this moment was its tone. There was no bitterness, no desire to litigate the past. Sambora did not ask for a second act on the same stage. He did not frame himself as wrong beyond repair. Instead, he spoke as someone who understood that long partnerships can end without villains, and that accountability does not require self-destruction. The apology that took a decade did not change what happened in 2013. It did not undo the silence or the shock of his disappearance, but it changed how that silence could be understood. It transformed absence into intention, regret into reflection. And in doing so, it offered something rarer than reunion, a sense that the story, though unfinished in the way fans might wish, was finally told with honesty rather than myth. In the end, the story of Richie Sambora and Bon Jovi does not resolve with a triumphant return to the stage. There is no final encore designed to satisfy nostalgia, no symbolic handshake beneath stadium lights. Instead, there is something quieter and more honest, an acceptance that some partnerships complete their purpose and should not be forced to relive it. For fans raised on the mythology of eternal brotherhood, that truth can feel unsatisfying. But for the men who lived it, it may be the only form of respect left. A reunion has long been framed as the natural endpoint, the moment that would heal old wounds and restore balance to the narrative. Yet time has changed the calculus. Sambora's life now orbits around presence rather than performance. His music leans inward toward blues and reflection, toward projects that offer joy without pressure. Bon Jovi, facing his own physical limitations after vocal health struggles, has redefined his priorities as well. His focus is sustainability, not resurrection. The past is honored, but not revisited for spectacle's sake. This divergence does not erase what they built together. The catalog stands intact. The songs still carry their original charge, still ignite crowds, still soundtrack lives. Sambora's guitar work remains embedded in those recordings, inseparable from their emotional impact. Whether acknowledged explicitly or not, his influence is permanent. You cannot remove the soul from the strings without dismantling the songs themselves. In that sense, his legacy does not depend on proximity to the brand. It lives wherever those tracks are played. What makes this ending meaningful is not reconciliation, but clarity. Sambora's late honesty reframed his departure as an act of self-preservation rather than abandonment. John's restraint reframed leadership as boundary setting rather than dominance. Together, these perspectives offer a rare portrait of maturity in an industry that often rewards endless repetition. They demonstrate that honoring history does not require reenacting it. Sometimes it requires knowing when to stop. For a generation of artists watching from the sidelines, this story carries a cautionary lesson. Success can outgrow the relationships that made it possible. Systems built to endure can become inhospitable to the humans inside them. Leaving does not always mean failure. Staying does not always mean loyalty. The hardest decision is often choosing the version of success that allows you to remain whole. Sambora's evolution since leaving the band underscores that idea. He has spoken about therapy, about pride tempered by regret, about redefining meaning away from constant validation. His life now reflects a quieter confidence, one grounded in family and personal health rather than applause. That shift may never headline a tour announcement, but it represents a different kind of victory. In the absence of reunion, the legacy becomes clearer. Bon Jovi's music endures not because it can be replayed on demand, but because it captured a moment when collaboration still felt electric. Sambora and Bon Jovi met in that moment, created something larger than either of them, and then moved on when the cost became too high. The myth of reunion may linger, but the truth is stronger. Sometimes the most respectful ending is not a return, but a graceful goodbye that finally tells the story without pretending it can be rewritten.